Very good morning to all. It's a pleasure and privilege to have you all with us on this first webinar on the new National Education Policy 2020. We have with us the eminent guest, Dr. Shakila Shamsu ma'am and Honorable Vice Chancellor Professor Rajan Velukar. But before we start, just to let you know the audience, if you have any observations, suggestions, questions, you can put your questions in the question and answer. And once the session by the honorable guest and the vice chancellor is over, then we will be taking on one-to-one question, which either of the panelists will be answering. So, welcome all. And this webinar is on new national education policy. And as we have seen that education is the greatest key to achieving social justice and equality. Inclusive and impartial education is crucial to achieving an inclusive community in which each and every individual has a right to dream, soar, and contribute to the country, leading it onto the path of success. And for this, we have to have ensured and standardized and universal means. Extensive research was done before this new national education policy was floated. Just to make the audience aware that the first national policy came around in 1968, then again in 1986, there was a revision happened in 1992. And after extensive gap of around 30 years, we have this new national education policy 2020. Now, there was a demand and there was a need for recognizing the long-standing approach towards the holistic education. This new national education policy focuses on universalization of education and providing vocational studies. That is what it has been incorporated into. This new policy is centered on quality, innovation and research, intended to enable India to become a knowledge superpower. This new national education policy is based on five foundation pillars of access, affordability, equity, quality, and accountability. And through this new education policy, a new assessment system such as performance assessment, review, and analysis of knowledge for holistic development, PARAK, for board examinations and interdisciplinary graduate courses. The focus will be on character building and not merely on earning a qualification to secure a job, what Madam has just said. But before we have a session, I would like to introduce my honorable guest, Dr. Shakila Shamsu ma'am, who is formerly an officer on special duty in new education policy in the Department of Higher Education, MHRD, and was also the nodal officer of the flagship scheme of National Mission on Teachers and Teaching. She has been the secretary to the committee to draft national education policy, and prior to this, she held senior positions like OSD on 12th Plan, MHRD, and Joint Advisor for Education, Planning Commission. Her core areas cover education planning and policy making, teachers education, ICT-enabled learning, open and distance learning, and inclusive education. Her academic career spans a total of around 39 years with the University of Mumbai, IGNOU, and with the Government of India. And ma'am is very well averse with the nuances which undergoes before any new policy comes into picture. And she has served on a number of committees for the preparation of plan documents and report on various aspects of education. We also have the pleasure of having with us the Honorable Vice Chancellor for our university, Professor Rajan Velukar, sir. Sir is having more than 33 years of experience with the Indian higher education system as a teacher, development leader, quality innovator, technology adopter, administrator, and policy advisor. Sir is having a passion to make a difference to the lives of the students and learners through involvement as a policy and opinion leader, as well as actually implementing development initiatives that has made him known into the higher education field as a well-versed professional. Sir has held various positions, including Vice Chancellorship, Directorship, Secretary positions in the government, Asia-wide officer's role, membership of numerous committees, associations, and bodies across the globe. Just to name a few, Sir was a provost with the Somaiya Group of Institutions, Vice Chancellor, University of Mumbai, Vice Chancellor, Yashwantrao Chavan, Maharashtra Open University, in charge Vice Chancellor for SNDT Women's University, and he was also a Senior Program Officer at the Commonwealth Secretariat for CYP Asia region. Sir has worked on the numerous important committees of National Knowledge Commission, University Grants Commission, National Assessment and Accreditation Council, Film and Television Institute of India, with the central government, state government, and various important education institutions. So it's a pleasure and honor for our university to have with us the two distinguished guests. Ma'am, now over to you to brief upon the new National Education Policy 2020.
Thank you, Dr. Rohit, for saying kind words about my introduction. And thanks to Professor Rajan Velukarji to have kindly invited me to this national webinar on the currently very hot topic that we have in education sector and the long awaited new National Education Policy 2020. I must say that though the particular audience I believe would be largely interested in the higher education recommendations of the NEP 2020, it would be only befitting to understand what the policy tries to do with regard to school education also. The rationale behind that is because in the National Education Policy, we have tried to look at education as a single continuum, a continuum which starts from age 3, goes on up to higher education as a single thread without trying to compartmentalize each subsector within that. The idea is that what has happened over the years is that we have tried to focus on maybe elementary education or secondary education or vocational education or higher education or pre-primary, which has largely been outside the Ministry of Education. And we no longer call it MHRD. We actually, even in my CV, I should be writing it as Ministry of Education. The Cabinet has also approved the change in the nomenclature of the Ministry of Human Resource Development to the Ministry of Education. That has been an approval and therefore the nomenclature change. So we looked at education from different subsectors, as a result of which the total continuum, because as far as the child is concerned, it is one single thread. For the child, it is really not mattering which level the child is really going through. For us also as educationists, I think when we compartmentalize it, we tend to give focus to some area and tend to give less focus to the other area. So the committee wanted to look at it in a single continuum as a single thread with the purpose of trying to create holistic individuals who will become better citizens of tomorrow, who will be equipped with the 21st century skills, who will become people who can deal with the challenges of a global economy, and who will be value-based in trying to understand that we are a sustainable society and we need to have homogeneous living, not only with our fellow citizens, but with the environment and with other forms of life that form a part of this universe. That has been the vision with which we have tried to bring about this policy. And therefore, I would try to say that higher education ultimately is a feeder route that comes from the school education. And the disconnect between school education and higher education, which has been largely there in the past, needs to be sort of remedied. I wouldn't say that it was an error. It was only that a growing country or an independent country from colonialism and a growing developing nation would have prioritized the importance of elementary education to a great extent. And actually what has happened is elementary education got a lot of focus and higher education got a focus. The intervening link was the secondary education, which has fallen between the stools. And it is this secondary education which actually acts as a feeder for the higher education. So you see the maximum number of dropouts happening in classes 8 or classes 10 or classes 12, and therefore the transition rate from the school education to the higher education has been drastic. This is why we thought that we should look at it in totality, and many of our targets are aimed at trying to ensure continued retention of the child up to secondary education and further on to higher education. We have not really said about universalizing higher education, but we have said about universalization up to secondary education, not universalization just of secondary education, but universalization up to secondary education. That is a child of age 3 continuing up to age 18, and thereby going with the principle that the child who's had a learning experience up to age of 18 should have a joyful learning experience, not see learning as a burden. One of the main reasons why this particular policy has tried to retain the same principles in school education and in higher education is the flexibility part of it. The flexibility is essential because unlike persons like the Vice Chancellor and myself, who had come from an education system where we sort of looked at education as being the only driver of change and the leverage for growth, today's children actually need to be equipped with not just education and knowledge, but a number of other things like the skills, the values, all that go to make a fully well-rounded individual. But to do that, do not put them in rigid structures. Unshackle their mind, unshackle their potential, liberate them from the rigid structures of curricular choices. And that is why even in school education and even in higher education, the flexibility in the choice of subjects. In school education, we have said that we will do away with the hard silos that exist between curricular, co-curricular, extracurricular, arts, science, vocational, academic. Allow a child who is excelling in sports, excelling in music, excelling in carpentry, excelling in some form of art, along with having, let us say, a decent foundation in social sciences or pure sciences or applied knowledge, to do it together. Today, we have not recognized the potential of the child and forced the child to make decisions in regarding the choice of subjects not as per the aptitude, talent and potential of the child. As a consequence of which, child looks at a school as the experience of burden, not a experience of joy. That has got to be unshackled and that has got to be changed. To do that, it is the policy talks about allowing, I would request all of you, more than reading it from chapter 1 onwards, read the policy in the introduction. We have underlined certain basic foundational principles of this policy, saying the one principle we have said, recognize the unique potential of every single child and nurture it so that that child's learning is optimized or maximized. And based on that, the principle of flexibility, based on the principle of multilingualism, based on that, the principle that you should have number of choices, promoting multidisciplinarity and allowing for cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary, intradisciplinary choice of subjects being given to the students. It is in that same spirit that we have talked in school education, a major change, which is not a structural change, but it is more a curricular and pedagogical change. The existing 10+2 that we talk about has been split into 5+3+3+4. Why did we do this? The first 5 years, starting from age 3 up to age 8, is what we call is the foundational stage, and we have recommended a very strong foundation through early child care and education. I don't think this group of academics need to understand. Today, the fairly well-to-do sections of the society send the children to what we call a play school or a preschool. The evidence shows that the neural networks of a child's brain develops maximum between the ages of 3 to 6. And that is when the assimilation or the ability to grasp is actually activated in the child's neural networks. So the children who come from well-to-do families, their learner preparedness is built upon in a very effective manner, making them very amenable to learning what is there in formal learning starting from class 1. The rest of them who go to the Anganwadi system, which has done yeoman service in the field of health and nutrition, but where education does not get a lot of this thing, and therefore playway method, creative abilities of children are not nurtured. Those children find it very difficult suddenly when they come into class 1, where formal learning starts taking place. So the first 5 years are the foundational corresponding to ages 3 to 8. Between 8 to 11, we are talking about the preparatory stage, where you are just introducing the child to understanding very, very fundamental basic things. Subsequently, between 11 to 14, which we call the middle stage, that stage we are actually developing more into the conceptual understanding, so that when they finally come to the secondary stage between the ages of 14 to 18, the child is able to actually make lot of choices as to what are the potentials and what the child may be able to understand best when they go on for higher education. This restructuring is not a restructuring of the school. It is a restructuring in which the curricula will be exposed. It is a restructuring in which the teachers will use different kinds of pedagogy to ignite the cognitive ability, the spirit of inquiry, creative thinking, application-based use of hands or the psychomotor skills, aptitudes and values, talents for every field that the child may have, so as to actually allow a student to improve upon the learning levels and have better learning outcomes at each stage of learning, and imbibe all this. Ultimately, education is for bringing about a transformation in the individual to make them, it is like polishing a diamond. And talking to a university in Surat, I'm sure that example relates very well to you. It is you have a child which is like a rock, and you polish it, and then it shines through and becomes such a beautiful diamond. The same way education has got to do that. And for doing that, you cannot start forcing children to do things that they do not like, they do not relate to, they don't find it relevant. And this particular policy, which is the first policy of the 21st century, irrespective of the fact that we had policies earlier, looked at new challenges. Today, you are not in a position to say what jobs tomorrow will be there in the world. Artificial intelligence, technology, big data, 3D animation, these are all taken over, and the dynamic changes that are happening. You need to empower students with what we call the 21st century skills of communication, of critical thinking, of cognitive learning, of collaborative team spirit, dealing with crisis, change management, adaptability, value-based thinking. All these are 21st century skills, and these have to be honed in our children. These have to be passed on to our students, young students. We are saying India is a country, we are proud of having the youngest country in the world with an average age of just 29, whereas world over the population is a graying population. If we want this large number of youth to become empowered, it cannot be just by having a degree in hand. It has to be with also the kind of skills that are necessary for a changing dynamic society, where change is taking place so fast that we will find that jobs become obsolescent and therefore you will find that you have become irrelevant, your educational degree is becoming irrelevant. And it is in this spirit that we have talked about the recommendations in higher education. Therefore, in the higher education, the most critical recommendation, and when I was seeing the video clip of Aura University, I was happy to see that liberal arts is already there in the university. We have tried to promote holistic, multidisciplinary education, which is nothing but liberal arts education, where we are saying that human potential, whether it is in sciences, social sciences, engineering, medicine, agriculture, the arts, languages, sports, vocational education, all these form a part of the making of an individual. And therefore, higher education institutions will not confine themselves to only arts, science, commerce, engineering, medicine, technology, law, agriculture, sports, yoga. All these cannot be seen. Teacher education cannot be seen as independent standalone, but all higher educational institutions will become multidisciplinary in nature, offering a variety, a bouquet of courses to the students, and students will have the flexibility to pick up credits from all these courses and major in more than one discipline in a very flexible, modular manner. In the modular sense, we have been recommending a 3 or 4 year undergraduate program, degree program, where the student will have the flexibility not only with regard to the choice of subjects, but also with regard to the period of completion. The student has the flexibility to complete a year, exit it, get a certificate for that year completed, go out, maybe take up a job, maybe take a sabbatical for whatever reason, come back and rejoin in second year. This can go on from both first year, second year, third year. The final, the 4-year degree program will be a 4-year multidisciplinary degree program. So it is modular and flexible because at each stage, the student is having the choice of deciding whether the student wants to do continuously the 4 years or whether the student wants to join the first year, leave after first year or second year. But for each year completed, it is not seen that the student is a failure. For each year completed, the student is given a certificate. On completion of first year, the student is given a certificate. On completion of second year, the student is given a diploma. On completion of third year, the student is given a normal bachelor's degree. And the 4th year completed, the student is given a bachelor's degree in multidisciplinary education. For 3-year degree program, the student will do a 2 years master's program. So there are 2 forms of master's program. Person who's done 4 years will do only a 1 year's master's program. So we have allowed, now you may ask me a question, how is it that I am studying in a university where only technology subjects are taught or only agriculture is taught, and tomorrow we may not have faculty for all the other disciplines that I want to take in music or sports and so on. We have allowed still greater flexibility. A student, we have created a concept called an academic bank of credit. It is unique to every student. It is like your money bank account. Just as you pull in money that comes in from different sources into a bank account, similarly, a student will acquire credits for courses taken from a number of educational institutions. It can be not just Oro University, it can be Central University of Gujarat, it can be University of Mumbai, it can be University of Delhi. The student is having a flexibility to take either a regular course from any of these universities or a purely online course or a complete MOOCs, irrespective of the mode of delivery, add on to the credits, and finally the student in 3rd year may have to decide which will be the subject in which I want to major in. The student may like to major in computing and maybe music, may take on maybe mechanical engineering and maybe painting, but the student has the flexibility to do that. This is what we have talked about as the holistic multidisciplinary undergraduate education with choices of flexibility in the subjects or the disciplines without having disciplinary boundaries, in the choice of completing the course, and also deciding from where that student would do that, because until we allow institutions to become fully multidisciplinary, you will have to share the academic resources of other institutions. The idea is that over a period of time, and that will take quite some time, maybe 10 to 15 years, till the HEIs become multidisciplinary, we will allow for these kind of facilities to allow students to acquire credits from a number of universities, either in distance mode or in online course or in a fully MOOCs course, or from universities that are there in different parts of the country. As the flexibility that we can do is because an academic bank of credit is becoming a reality. If anyone of you have watched the VC's conclave, it has already been announced that this will be done very soon. So we have, of course, as a university to think, how prepared are we to go towards it? So one important aspect of this particular policy, the NEP 2020, is that we want parents as the major stakeholders, as teachers as the major stakeholders, and the students to understand the nuances of this particular recommendation and not be carried away by a mindset by thinking that all these changes will be against the interest of all of us. Not at all. It is only that we resist change. We resist any attempt to move from our comfort zone. Currently, we feel that this is the most comfortable position for our education. But it is not so, because if it was the most comfortable position, why is it that our students are not performing well? Why is it that our students are not able to relate to the world of work? Why is it that the students, when they join a place of work, are not able to perform effectively there? Why is it at the bottom line, why is it that students who have a fully qualified degree are not able to get jobs also? If that has to change, then the manner in which we try to educate our children has to change. Higher education institutions itself, India has the largest higher education systems in the world. And this higher education system has become so unwieldy and complex and complicated that people are confused what are the types of institutions we have. We have deemed universities, we have affiliated colleges, we have constituent colleges, we have private affiliating colleges, we have centrally funded universities, we have state universities, we have a plethora of categorized set of higher education institutions, all seeming to have different governance structures, different academic calendars, different styles of courses being offered, and the management of these institutions have become a huge complex exercise. In order to bring about a certain degree of rationalization and consolidation, we are talking about a restructuring of the higher education institutions, which again, let me tell you with a pinch of salt, none of these recommendations will happen overnight. None of them may happen in a year or two. These are all long stretched reforms which will gradually evolve. Any change in the social sector will not be overnight changes. It is not bringing out like a law and saying that tomorrow this is going to be happening. No, it is something that has to be done with the consensus and with the coordinated effort and with the cooperation of all people accepting that this is the goal, and we will try to achieve it in about 3 to 5 years or 5 to 7 years or 7 to 10 years. It is a question of students having preparedness, the institution having preparedness, the governments having preparedness to implement it. That is why we have said the policy has come, but the real work starts now in trying to implement it. The implementation of a policy is much, much harder than bringing out a policy. So in the higher education, we are saying that instead of trying to categorize institutions by the ownership or by the legislation which created it, can we categorize it by the role it performs? So we have said, can universities become research intensive universities or teaching intensive universities? Or finally we have said, would we have, because we have around 45,000 we have 45,000 colleges in this country, can they become autonomous degree granting colleges? That means if they have got to become degree granting colleges, they have to break away from their university, which means it is like a child moving away from the family, the father and the mother, and becoming independent. The affiliation system, therefore, over a period of 15 years, we would like it to actually vanish. But to remove the affiliation system, we are saying that the host university will do a lot of hand-holding, would do a lot of mentorship, allow the institution to achieve certain benchmarks of excellence and quality so that they get accreditation. And having achieved that, we will still give them graded autonomy till they become fully autonomous. So many negative feedback that has been written in the media is that affiliation system is going to stop and all our colleges will be sort of non-existent, and it is a system where colleges all will have to perish. No, those which will perish are the ones which have not maintained the minimum academic standards and achieved certain quality benchmarks. Yes, some will perish because you cannot have a college offering a degree of a university and none of those graduates having any jobs available in the market at all, which means that college is not doing what its purpose is to be. Not giving a degree is not the purpose only of a college. The college also needs to provide a rewarding educational experience to the learner and empower that learner to deal with the world of work. So, affiliation system needs to be phased out. In fact, all those who are educationists will understand that higher education, one of the major problem areas or the bane of higher education has been the affiliating system. And therefore, over a period of 15 years, we are talking of the affiliation system gradually being phased off to strengthen these colleges to become autonomous degree granting colleges with a lot of mentorship, hand-holding, and giving them quality chances and enabling mechanisms to become accredited, and having become accredited, to give them graded autonomy, starting with academic autonomy, then with administrative autonomy, and then with financial autonomy. That is the idea of the new transformational system about our higher education system. Now, about the standalone institutions. We have standalone institutions for management, we have standalone institutions for pharmacy, for agriculture, for medicine, for technology, and so on. We want all these institutions and teacher education, that's the main core area. We want all these institutions to gradually move to become multidisciplinary institutions. You will find that this is a major reform, because you will see that people are wondering, are we going to transform IITs and IIMs and agriculture universities and medical universities and law universities and teacher educational institutions to become multidisciplinary? Yes, we would like them to become so. We would like them to actually start offering all these other subjects. Until they are not able to offer them, allow the student through the academic bank of credit to do courses from other places and finally have a degree, not just telling about BTech or being an MBA or so on, but to say that the person is having a proper bachelor's in holistic education or whatever nomenclature that the regulator will try to bring about once we have new guidelines and the regulatory system is put in place. Now, coming to the teachers, we are aware that any change that needs to take place needs to come through the teaching faculty. Currently, we find that the service conditions of the faculty themselves leave a lot to be desired. We do not give the faculty the right kind of service conditions, by which there is no space for them to sit, there is not much of research that is possible for them to do, the kind of timetable that is given to them forces them to merely go like robots into a class. 45 minutes the person is talking something and walking out of the class without even having understood whether the student is able to actually understand. Why that the faculty is forced to do that? I speak that as a faculty myself. As a faculty, we don't have the freedom to even decide in the autonomy. See, faculty is the king in the classroom, and the faculty should have the autonomy to decide on the manner in which that curricular transaction will take place. Forget even the transaction, the faculty should have a right even in the framing of that curriculum, and then decide on the manner of that curricular transaction and the pedagogical methods and the tools that the faculty may use. Why? The ultimate purpose is to ensure that the core subject that the teacher or the faculty is teaching is actually well understood and assimilated by the student, to use that in the, not just for the examination, but to understand it for the purposes of further living itself. Today, the confinement of faculty is only to cover a certain syllabi for the purposes of examination. As a consequence of that, neither the richness of that subject is understood by the student, and neither is the faculty having the freedom to innovate in that. And as a consequence, the learning outcomes are only by cramming, doing rote learning, and studying from guides and cheap textbooks that are available in the market without really understanding that subject altogether. We want to change that altogether. For empowering both the student and the teacher, the manner in which curricular transaction will take place would allow for a lot of innovation to encourage children to start thinking on their own. That is why we said it is not how to learn, but learning how to learn. It is not how to think, but learning how to think in the most effective manner, so that you are actually understanding, assimilating, making a critical understanding, questioning things, and then coming out. Therefore, you have a better grasp of that particular subject. So for students, the optimal learning environments we have created, at the same time trying to say that students have problems, We will have academic counseling. We will have induction meetings so that they are prepared for college education. We will have psychological counsel to deal with stress, because we are living in a highly isolated environment where, particularly in the COVID times, that isolation has become even much more. So we have talked about counseling being very critical for our higher education students. We have also said that students come from different sections of the society, and therefore equity considerations and inclusion on how to provide financial assistance to children who come from not so well-to-do sections. In the film that was shown on Aura University, I was happy to see that there are merit-based scholarships. We have said that every child who is aspiring for higher education and who is having the merit to do so should be encouraged, and not having the power to pay the fees should not be a factor that prevents them from coming into education. So a lot of financial assistance for those who are actually wanting to go into higher education but are limited by their economic conditions have been sought to be removed by creating a gender inclusion fund, by creating a social inclusion fund, by creating a number of scholarships which have to be given both by public institutions and by private institutions. I would urge you to read the chapter 14 on equity and inclusion in higher education, which is aimed at actually saying how do we increase the educational participation of children coming from the socially and economically disadvantaged groups. This particular chapter tries to talk about the vulnerability of the scheduled castes, the scheduled tribes, the OBCs, the minorities, children with learning disabilities, children living in tribal areas, children living in geographically inaccessible regions, children who belong to the urban poor, children who are victims of child trafficking, children who are transgenders, children who come from migrant labor communities. All these have been specifically mentioned as belonging to the category of socially economically disadvantaged groups. And for their educational participation, a number of measures have been put in place. And this becomes very important for a teacher or a faculty. Classrooms in India are very heterogeneous classrooms. You have first generation learners who may be able to speak very fluent English, but you have first generation learners who are not at all familiar with English, pardon me, and you would have very good learners coming from elite societies who are actually very fluent in English, not very good, who are very well off coming from that, and different social categories and different types of students. Handling diversity in classroom is the greatest challenge of a faculty or a teacher in school education as much as a faculty in higher education. And let me also tell you, normally schools do not have so much of a diverse classroom as much as higher education institutions, because schools are within a given geographical vicinity, and usually you will find that the social homogeneity of that group is more or less similar, except with terms because of our linguistic, religious and other diversity. But when it comes to higher education, you will have a student from Bihar, you will have a student from Maharashtra, you will have a student from Northeast, you will have a student coming from South India, you will have them coming from different economic strata, different communities, different languages, and the faculty needs to understand the diversity of the classroom and look at education from the point of view of each one of them, because as a country we are committed to sustainable development, which means that no child should be left behind, and therefore it is even more important that we pay importance to the academic counseling, the social counseling and the psychological counseling of students coming from not so, let us say, encouraging backgrounds when they come into higher education. Ultimately, the policy has said that we will achieve a gross enrollment ratio of 50% in higher education from the current 26.3%, which is a double jump. By 2035, in 15 years, we are saying we will double the number of students in higher education. One sign of a developed economy and a developed nation is the number of children coming into higher education. And therefore, as a quantitative target, we have said that we will achieve 50% gross enrollment ratio, which means we are going to bring almost about additional 3.5 crore students into the higher education system. And these 3.5 crore students can come in through only face-to-face education. And that is why we have emphasized upon open and distance learning in higher education. And MOOCs, blended courses, online education, all these as being alternate channels. And most importantly, we have embedded vocational education within mainstream education. Because many find that just a degree without having any exposure to vocational education does not make meaning. So in our 4-year multidisciplinary program, we are also allowing students to take up vocational subjects so that, as I said, if there are new jobs and I know a particular vocational trade, it is possible that I may be able to survive by getting a relevant job that at a given point of time, that particular skill may be useful to that particular student. So on access, on equity, on quality, we have put a number, and I've also talked about affordability. Now the question is of accountability. And when you talk of accountability, you come to the regulatory system and the internal governance of an institution. We want all higher education institutions to be free from external interference, external governmental interference. And therefore, the idea of autonomous institutions means that it should have within its own body a very good governing structure. And that is why the Board of Governors has been articulated as one of the critical recommendations for a very strong internal governance, which will be headed by a number of eminent educationists, a number of cross-section of stakeholders who are related to that higher education institution, who will work for the betterment of that educational growth of that institution. And this Board of Governors will be having a critical role in the institutional development plan of that higher education institution to become a better research organization, to become a better teaching institution, and to empower our students with the right kind of courses which will give them right kind of exposure to the world of work. The internationalization aspect is also a very critical part. We have allowed that Indian universities can open campuses outside, so much as outside foreign universities can come here. Idea is to bring about a globally competitive edge. Many of us don't like the word competition, but let me tell you, competition forces us to stretch our benchmarks to reach better heights. And therefore, student mobility, faculty mobility, and institutionalization forms the basis of internationalization that we have recommended. On the regulatory structure, which maybe this group, if it is full of only teachers and students, may not be very keen on knowing, but you must know the nuance of it. We have said that the existing regulatory body of UGC, AICTE, National Council for Teacher Education will all go to be merged within a body that we call the Higher Education Commission of India, which will have 4 independent verticals based on the principle of separation of powers, separation of funding powers, accreditation of academic standards and regulation. And therefore, the chapter on the regulatory system is in keeping with the principle of better accountability, preventing over-concentration of powers in one single body, and separating out powers so that these powers can be independently handled by these 4 independent bodies without entering or stepping onto the shoes of the other bodies. Finally, I would like to focus on the aspect relating to the teacher education. The existing teacher education which provides the B.Ed programs are offering in a standalone institution a 2-year B.Ed program. And we would like that these will be becoming 4-year multidisciplinary integrated programs like BA B.Ed or BSc B.Ed, and this would be the norm from about, I think we have put it as about 2023 or 2024, and over a period of 10 years, all standalone B.Ed institutions will either move to become multidisciplinary or they will be forced to shut down. This is what we have recommended for teacher education. And speaking about faculty in higher education, we have said about tenure track, because we have said that people who complete an extended probation and prove that they are able to actually deliver in the classroom with better learning outcomes of students, they will be allowed to grow in the career growth, and therefore there is a degree of accountability that is coming in for the faculty, and that degree of accountability is not coming with the current system of API scores or the career advancement scheme that is being done right now, but will be judged on the basis of certain professional standards. I would ask you to see the National Professional Standard for Teachers, where professional standards would be laid for each level of education that the faculty is teaching. And therefore, that would be the norm setting factor to decide on the confirmation after the tenure track. Once confirmed, we have allowed for continuous building and professional growth tenure track to lead up to positions of academic leadership. One of the most important aspects of this policy for faculty is that a person who has joined as an assistant professor can aspire at the beginning itself to become the chancellor of the university. That kind of a career growth and the right kind of training to provide academic leadership given the policy, so that there is a proper channel of growth from becoming a faculty to becoming an academic administrator, an educational administrator, to move on to positions of authority like the Vice Chancellor. I think on higher education, even on school education, our linchpin is the student. The criticality and the dignity of the teacher has been brought in, and the dignity of the teaching profession has been emphasized. We have wanted to strengthen all public educational systems while recognizing that private sector is very much there, and therefore public and private should be treated on par. And finally, we have said, let us empower the central, the state governments decisions with regard to the institutions that are there within their control. Because education is a subject in the concurrent list and we are living in a federal government, and therefore the center and the states are equal players, and that is why the body that we call the Central Advisory Board on Education, which is the apex body, we have said would be strengthened so that the voice of the state governments would be heard and changes would be made in consensus and in consultation with the state governments. Because in policy, as I said, implementation is the key, and implementation is done not by only the central institutions. Implementation is done by the states coming together. The larger sector is lying in the states, and therefore the center and the states, along with the private sector, should come together, and the stakeholders, the parents, the teachers and the students need to be working together to make this policy NEP 2020 a real success. So the challenge is in our hands. Let each one of us work together in a spirit of cooperation so that this policy can become a reality over a period of 10 to 15 years. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for helping us understand the nuances of the new national education policy in very lucid manner. You have helped us to understand the single continuum through which the progression of the students will move. And I assume and hope that the gross enrollment ratio should increase, and the target of getting 50% by 2035 from the current state of 26.3% should be there. And just to brief you, ma'am, that at Oro University we have the 4 aspects of vertical of education which we focus upon. One, we call it physical education, giving emphasis on the sports and the all other activities which help in the growth of the individual. The second one is the mental education. Third was the vital education, and the fourth one is the spiritual education. And vital is the emotional education. So you have also explained what are the various skill sets which a student should need, what are the various values which a student must be taught in order to take him out from the rigid structure and make him come into the process of flexibility and unshackling the very systemized, routinized process of teaching and learning. Thank you so much, ma'am. There are certain questions which I will take once the Professor Velukar will finish off his talk. Professor Velukar, over to you, sir. Sir, unmute yourself. Yes, sir.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yeah, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rohit, Dean of the Oro University, for giving me few minutes to be before all the participants. But I must thank Dr. Shakila for giving time to us and spoke on higher education and school education together and about the new education policy. I think none other than you, because I know the value of the secretary who writes the report completely, understand the whole report holistically and in an integrated manner. So we are fortunate and the audience is fortunate to know the new education policy from the horse's mouth, I would say. Because all other members might have given their briefs and their participation in whatever thoughts they had, but then compiling is very, very important. And I must thank you for putting the new education policy in a complete perspective. Thank you very much. And I must compliment you for this great work. And I'm happy to meet you virtually after a long, long time. But let us meet sometime face to face also in the university. I don't think I should take much time because the way in which you have narrated the entire new education policy, I don't want to dilute that. And you are the main speaker. But the only thing which I would like to reflect upon and I would like to suggest to the audience and to the participants is that you must learn reading between the lines. In this new education policy, which we are talking since last so many years, the changes which have been brought in this new education policy, I remember when we were talking about WTO and GATS in 2000, around that, we were talking about this flexibility, we were talking about democratization of higher education, and later we were talking about choice-based credit system, and later I remember in 2003 when I gave my first speech in the Commonwealth Secretariat, there I mentioned that if a biology student wants to learn photography, why are we not allowing that person to learn photography? So I am really happy that whatever thoughts I had in my mind over a period of time, most of them I find in this new education policy. So thank you very much, Madam, for enlightening all of us on the new education policy. I use the word democratization of education. Now what the democratization of education is, the learner gets the flexibility. Learner decides what he or she wants to learn. That is the key for development of a person. The moment you empower these young people or empower the learners to take charge of their life, there will be a difference. And precisely that is what you have narrated in your discourse or your lecture. To all these things, what we call is vertical literacy. Now in vertical literacy, what is important? Self and the society. It is not only for the self, but it is also for the society. Unless and until you think for the society, unless and until with you support the transformation of the society, coexistence will not happen. And therefore, when I am talking about vertical literacy, I am talking about co-creation, collaboration. Individual growth is not going to help anyone. And therefore, we need to read between the lines in this entire new education policy and interpret it your way so that you can take it forward. A lot of things needs to be done. We need to change the mindset. We need to train the people, because that is the most important thing. Because these are the new things which some of the people might not have heard of. And therefore, the most important thing which we need to do is the training part of it, which also the new education policy mentions about. In the last century, we were doing horizontal literacy. In the 21st century, we need to understand what vertical literacy is, what democratization of education is. And this new education policy is giving you an opportunity to understand what vertical literacy is. You must read. I am not going to give a long speech, but I am just reading between the lines from this new education policy and one or two examples which I want to give. Now, when Madam has talked about the interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity, we need to understand what it is. We need to understand perspective. In the new education policy, the policy talks about multidisciplinarity, that you can go and then do some course in other discipline. But the new education policy is giving a message to go beyond that and understand what interdisciplinarity is, understand what multidisciplinarity is, and understand what transdisciplinarity is. Then only we will be able to achieve what we want to achieve through this new education policy. Now, what do we mean by interdisciplinary approach? It is not that you are doing physics and you are then going and doing a biology. No, that is not the use. That will not be useful to you. That will not help. So, what interdisciplinarity is, we need to understand what it does. It analyzes, it synthesizes, and harmonizes the link between disciplines, the different disciplines, into a coordinated and coherent whole. That is the meaning of interdisciplinary. Not that you are doing physics and going and doing biology. No use. Then what the multidisciplinarity means? We need to understand that. Now, it draws knowledge from different disciplines, but stays with their own boundaries. Say, for example, medicine. Now, in medicine, there is a use of technology, there is a use of mathematics, there is a use of physics, there is a use of chemistry, and there is a use of several other things. I invited one Nobel laureate in University of Mumbai in 2013. You know, he was an international athlete and his basic degree was in physical education. You will not believe. His basic degree was in physical education, but he got a Nobel Prize in chemistry. But he has used his basic discipline of physical education, and because he was an international athlete, won medals also, he brought other disciplines into his discipline to take that discipline forward. Physics, mathematics, statistics, chemistry, biochemistry, biology, medicine. 6-7 disciplines together, and therefore he could invent something. And on that he has got the Nobel Prize. So it is for us to understand what all this is. And therefore I said reading between the lines is very, very important. And then what the transdisciplinary approach is. Now it integrates. Transdisciplinary is integration. Unless and until we understand this from this point of view, to that I say, knowing is not the problem to our country. Not doing is the problem. And therefore the government of India has enabled all of us to do all these things. And therefore I say this is an opportunity for all of us to transform our nation. And therefore this transdisciplinarity integrates natural, social and health sciences in a humanities context and transcends their traditional boundaries. You have to go beyond your boundaries. Then only you will understand what new education policy is. The only thing which is, I felt, madam, is we have not dealt much on assessment, because there is a very different kind of assessment. We have gone beyond formative and summative evaluation. You are from education and therefore you will understand what I am speaking. The whole evaluation is based on reflection today. That is called as assessment as learning, where you are empowering the learners to take charge of their life. You are empowering them to take decisions of how they are learning, to know how they are learning, what they are learning, so that in a complexly complex world, they will be able to address the problems which they are going to face in their life. And therefore that is what I felt. And of course there are a number of things which I can, but I am not the main speaker, and I too wanted to listen to Dr. Shakila madam. So thank you very much madam for giving us time, and I am sure the participants must be having a lot of questions to you. So I leave the platform for them to ask you questions. I'm sure.
Thank you for the kind words, sir.
Over to Rohit. Rohit, आवाज नहीं आता है.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir, for sharing your thoughts. I would request the participant to raise their hand so that we may allow them to ask the questions. But there is one anonymous question, ma'am, which says, what are the teaching training programs measures for the implementation of the new national education policy?
Can I respond?
Yeah.
So Rohit, I think in the policy what we have written is that the existing ongoing training programs of capacity building would continue. But like the Vice Chancellor has said, we have also tried to say that the kind of training that would be needed in the new educational environment will have to be provided for that. So as far as school, it is very easy, because for school education, but one major thing that we need to understand is this policy has accepted that teacher education is a part of higher education. It's been a long-standing demand that as a discipline of teacher education, the teacher education should, whether you prepare teachers for early childcare education or school education or secondary education or even higher education, discipline needs to come into the higher education system. That has been done by actually putting teacher education as part of the higher education system. But as far as the faculty of higher education is concerned, the policy reiterates that while the existing training programs will continue, there will be new innovative teacher training programs on a sustained basis for continuous and comprehensive capacity building of faculty, which will not be merely to call them for 2 days program and then conduct a series of activities and allow them to go on their own. The training programs will be very scientifically designed so that we meet the needs of the new changing curricula, and very rightly the pedagogy, and most importantly, like the Vice Chancellor had mentioned, the assessment for that. It is not that the policy is silent. Let me use this opportunity to clarify that the policy has not talked about assessment within the higher education system, but the whole idea of Parak and bringing about the holistic report card at the school education, where the emphasis needs to move away from summative evaluation and rote learning assessment to assessing the child's critical thinking abilities, is what we are calling, and moving towards adaptive assessment, assessing the children as they learn. So the assessment for a slow learner and the assessment for a high performer cannot be equated, which is what currently we are doing, and therefore we put the stigma of a failure. If my assessment of the learner as per the ability to comprehend, it is known as adaptive assessment through technology, which will judge the learning ability of the child and put questions meant on the learning that the child has acquired rather than by a uniform norm that we have decided. Now, this kind of assessment, which we will start in the school education, will gradually flow into the higher education also. And the training programs that we think for the higher education faculty will be related to the use of technology, will be related to the new curricular method, curricular structures, what new curriculum development can take place, which is interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, will be on the pedagogical tools that we may have to use, the new methods of teaching so that it is learner-centric, and the assessment methods that will have to be there. So the training has been, as what needs to be covered is there. It has to be continuous, that also we have said, but there has to be a rigor. Currently, training is where faculty go for 2 or 3 days, maybe a week, even 3 weeks your orientation and refresher, get a certificate only for the purpose of the career advancement. That will change because it is not the certification of the faculty as much as the faculty using what they have learned in the training program in the classroom situation for an enriched learning experience of the learners so that they perform better in a given subject. So existing programs will have to be recast, will have to be rejuvenated in a manner that meets the new learning environment. And this is visualized, and we expect that within maximum about 2 to 3 years, we will have a new training program. Already COVID has forced us to go in for online training. And COVID in a certain sense, where we would not have even thought of using technology. Today we are sitting like this for a webinar. We never would have gone to that. It has in a certain way become an accelerator where we have moved on to accepting technology for online learning, for online examinations and so on. But what is important is that the student and the teacher preparedness was not there when we moved towards online education. And in the policy, we have devoted 2 major chapters on technology and online education. In fact, online education we have added on post the COVID scenario because it was not visualized that time that we would have pandemics of this kind where it would be virtually impossible for us to come in a physical face-to-face program to conduct education. That is how online education has come in for a lot of focus. So our teachers need to be trained as much as preparedness of the students to accept it needs also to be, is a very important factor in this.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We have Monica Suri who will putting up the second question. Dr. Monica Suri, please.
Yes, thank you, sir, for giving me this opportunity, and thank you, ma'am, for simplifying the whole education policy for all of us. Though we'll go through the document thoroughly as an academician and will understand the technicalities of this. My question to you is like, ma'am, you brought into your conversation, you talked about the gaining competitive edge. So my submission and concern to you is like, I would like to learn from you more that is there any scope of mentoring of IITs and IIMs and all the central universities to the private universities as well, because we have so many best practices to share amongst each other. So I feel, and I always look forward that maybe we as academicians may not get a chance to be the part of IIM or IIT or maybe the central universities directly as an academician. And we are offering our services to universities, prestigious universities like Oro in the private sector, being qualified as per the eligibility criteria and everything. So my concern is like, is there any provision which has been made wherein IITs and IIM senior most professors can be the mentors to private universities like us, and they can be on the role with us and they can share with us what teaching pedagogy works for them. And though we keep on doing the webinars and FDP and conferences throughout the year, but I think their active involvement and engagement within the private university setup as an active mentor will surely take us to next level. So it's over to you, ma'am, for your further deliberations.
Yeah, Dr. Monica, thank you for asking that question. But I would like to say that even currently, one thing with the faculty is that we don't share our best practices. And that has been, we think of using that only from our own institution's point of view, rather than sharing it with other institutions around. This policy seeks to break that by having a proper national mentorship program. It has not been outlined so much. That mentorship is not as much as, mentorship is of two kinds. It is institutional mentorship and it is individual mentorship. We have not really outlined that, but the policy has set a national mentorship program, which could be individual mentorship as well as it could be institutional mentorship. But let me tell you, we are moving to a situation where the teacher is going to be the sole creator of the course. So a MOOCs course given by a Nobel laureate will be the one which students may want to take. So over a period of time, the teacher is actually marketing his or her knowledge and his or her teaching skills to the benefit of the entire student community, not confined only to your own university, but to any student who is aspiring to take that. That level of customization of teaching is going to take place. So you have seen SWAYAM, and we have about nearly 2,000 courses on SWAYAM. In SWAYAM, the course is not known by the name of the institution. The course is known by the person offering the MOOCs course. So it is the individual's teaching skills, pedagogical skills, as well as the content knowledge of that particular discipline that is getting sort of showcased on an e-platform. And the student, as a receiver of that or a consumer of that particular course, is deciding whether I need to do Monica's course or Rohit's course or Shakila's course. So we as faculty need to showcase our courses in a manner, but at the same time use such platforms by creating networks. So if you're a teacher, let us say you're a faculty of botany, we have a subject-based network under the National Mission on Teachers and Teaching for life sciences. We need to have a subject-based network which adds to the body of knowledge of that particular subject and make that knowledge available through knowledge networks to a number of students. That way, your own feeling that the IIT professor is standing at a much higher pedestal than you has to go. It is fallacious to think like that. You are as much a good faculty as much as an IIT faculty. Let us understand that we wanted in this particular policy to do away with that class hierarchy or stratification of institutions when we said that let us have teaching intensive universities. It can be an IIT also as much as an Oro or any other university coming. And as a faculty, please understand your strength and your best practices are as much as something which another faculty can learn. But we should first move away from our, what I may say, a very close-minded approach. What I know, I will not share. You don't talk between departments in the same institution. How do you develop interdisciplinarity for that? So, faculty needs to talk to each other, departments need to talk to each other, institutions need to talk to each other. And when you talk of mentorship, there is one slight hitch over here. There is a feeling of someone being superior and the mentor being superior and the mentee being not so superior. We need to look at both of them being on an equal footing for sharing of best practices. While mentorship may be good for hand-holding weaker institutions and weaker set of faculty, you need to move beyond mentorship to talk about sharing of best practices on an equal footing where both are recognized and respected for their own teaching abilities or their knowledge levels. That is the level at which, but I fully appreciate your point of view, and the NEP offers an opportunity for mentorship.
Thank you, ma'am. We will take the next question by Dr. Meghna Dangi, and she will be asking the question to you. Dr. Meghna Dangi, please. Meghna ma'am. Dr. Meghna Dangi.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, please go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you, madam, for sharing your deep insights into this particular NEP 2020 and making a lot of things clear to us. My question basically was regarding the increase in expenditure from 4% to 6%, which the government proposes, so that this particular NEP can actually be implemented across the nation in true essence and spirit. So, madam, according to your deliberation, I could understand that this mainly is going to give a boost and thrust to the students who go in government schools and all. My small submission is that can there be something of a direct benefit transfer to the students so that they can choose that where they really want to go to? According to me, this will, especially at the school level, this will really give a boost and something of a motivation for students to go to the school of their choice. When finally they go to government schools also, even the learning environment over there will improve, and I think this will really bring up the level of the education which is being provided at that level, as well as empower the students. That is my question, madam.
Thank you, Dr. Meghna. Meghna, right? I hope I got the name right.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. I think the school voucher system was analyzed in great depth, not only by this committee, but a number of several committees earlier. And in a country which has a large section of students not likely to go in for education, even though there is a Right to Education Act, a school voucher system, we are apprehensive, would have added to the divide within the society. With only such sections of the society gaining access to the schools that they want, and a large section where they are wondering how they can get their 2 square meals a day, not really having the luxury of being able to decide that. The very idea of government schools, government educational institutions not being able to provide quality education, and the dwindling numbers of students joining government schools in our race to move towards English medium instruction are all corrections that we have tried to address in this policy. By bringing about a policy where every single child, irrespective of his place of birth and the circumstances of birth, will have an equal right of education, but to provide a school voucher system, we were apprehensive, as I said, that it might not really work until we have achieved universalization up to secondary education. Maybe where we have acquired a certain degree of ensuring the retention of the child up to a certain level and then moving on. You see, it is every reform needs to go through a certain cycle of change. If you bring about a disruption in the social sector, which is suddenly seeming to be favoring a certain cross-section of the society, you will create a huge social divide. And we already are doing direct benefit transfer in terms of the scholarships, so that whatever leakages and all were taking place are not taking place, and ensuring that such kind of financial assistance is reaching the student itself. But we have still not reached up to that level to say that we will give the choices. When there is poverty staring at you, where there is malnutrition staring at you, you don't think of education. And you would therefore, child, irrespective of circumstances of birth and place of birth, would then gain education. It would have favored only a certain cross-section of the society. Coming to your extending the spending power or the public investment in education from 4% the current 4.3 to 6% is a joint effort by the center and the states coming together. And we also expect that we as a country don't tend to be very philanthropic by nature. And we think philanthropy is always something that happens internationally and not nationally. But here we are actually giving an opportunity, and it is a Herculean task, because currently also in the social sector, education may not get so much as health may get, because COVID is demanding a lot of resources going towards fighting that particular pandemic, which is the survival part of it. Only if we survive can we think of any other better form of education and so on. But 4.3 is the combined effort of the center and the state, all the Government of India ministries and the state governments coming together. It is, of course, in a resource crunched country, a very difficult task to achieve. But there are states, as far as the public expenditure is concerned, which is exceeding, that is not the investment. We are talking about how much they are spending on education. There is public expenditure in some states taking place to more than even 20%. Please don't confuse between the GDP and the public expenditure. This is the investment we are talking, the revenue that goes into it. The other is the expenditure that we are talking. Now, we have focused upon 6% GDP from 1968, reiterated in 1986. And even today, we have only been able to reach 4.43 because there is a growing population. There is every student aspiring to come into education, and rightly so. That becomes the responsibility of the government, because we think education is a public good, and therefore as a social good, it cannot be commercialized, or it cannot be marketized, or it cannot be commodified. And as long as we think that, it is the endeavor of the center and the states and philanthropic organizations to come together and see that. But we are doing Higher Education Financing Agency for giving loans to education institutions. We are having a large number of scholarships being given, and gradually, it may be a Herculean task, but we have also aimed to reach 6% GDP. And it is not to be seen just as a rhetoric, but we need to really move in that direction. But this is definitely a very difficult task to achieve.
Yeah, thank you so much, ma'am. Which is coming particularly to any specific policy on the funding to the higher education. And I have seen the document of the National Education Policy, where they have said that the Higher Education Grants Council will be responsible for providing the funds to the education institutions. So what are your thoughts on that, ma'am?
Yeah, so the University Grants Commission Act of 1956, if you see the name grants, it was only supposed to be a funding body. And at that time, the number of universities would have been hardly 50 or so in number. Today, it is being the grant body for the sector that has about nearly 1,000 universities. Of course, they give it only to their 2F and 12B institutions, which meet certain standards. But we have said that funding needs to be an activity which looked at independently. And therefore, this whole idea of taking away the powers of regulation fund, or rather separating the powers of regulation, funding, accreditation and academic standard setting, and creating an exclusive body between look at higher education grants. The idea therefore is to have focused attention by a new body which will look at the educational needs of institutions, decide on common norms based on performance-based norms, and therefore giving an incentive to institutions to perform better, to get the moving away from, let us say, criteria-based funding to norm-based funding in a transparent self-disclosure manner without having a lot of inspectorial regime. So institutions will be fairly assessed through a certain set of criteria which they will sort of seek to achieve, and therefore higher performing institutions will get higher grants, no doubt. But institutions will also, depending on their character and the considerations of equity, be given, say for example, institutions in the Northeast or institutions which are there in what we call the tribal areas. or institutions which we say are in aspirational districts, which are having a lot of other insurgency problems and therefore having law and order situations. There will be equity considerations, but all higher education institutions in the public system will have an equal ground in which they can try to leverage funds rather than decide by inspections and so on. This is the change. This again needs to be understood with the existing scheme that we have of the Higher Education Financing Agency, which gives loans to educational institutions for their development of infrastructure and so on, where the Government of India stands as the sole guarantor till the loan can be paid off by the institution. So that is also an enabling funding mechanism that is currently there, along with what will come with the new set of norms that the HEGC will bring out based on the Higher Education Commission of India bill getting passed as an act in the Parliament.
Thank you, ma'am. This will be the second last question, and I'm allowing Dr. Bhanu to please go ahead and ask it. Dr. Bhanu. Dr. Bhanu?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, sir. Thank you, Rohit, sir. Thank you, ma'am, for providing such information on new education policies. Ma'am, my question is, as you have said, in academic bank of credit system, students can opt any subject from any discipline in the system. So my question is, ma'am, what about the specialization of one or two subjects?
Yeah, so the student, let us assume for the sake of an assumption that a bachelor's undergraduate program consists of, let us say, 120 credits or so. Now, if the student wants to major in a given discipline, we will have to prescribe, it is not yet there as of now, we will have to prescribe that out of this 120 credits, let us assume that the student should do minimum 40 credits in a given discipline, and the person wants to major in two disciplines, the person will do 40 credits in, let us say, chemistry, 40 credits in, let us say, sociology. Therefore, the person has 40 plus 40, 80, that are the two majoring subjects. And let us say the student wants to do a minor. So two majors with one minor of 20 credits, that becomes 80 plus 20, 100. And the remaining 20, the student is free to take in any combination. So the credits assigned to a discipline can be decided by what we are calling now the General Education Council, which will lay down the standards, and we will have a national higher education qualifications framework. This qualifications framework will outline how many credits a student will have to acquire in a discipline to determine the majoring and the minoring, and that would be the area of specialization. So that there is, as of now, these are all still to be made, but the higher education qualification framework with the academic standard setting that will be done by the General Education Council and the professional standard setting body, plus the academic bank of credit, irrespective of which institution the student would do that and the mode of education, we would be able to then arrive at a decision on what that student has majored in and taken two majors and one minor, or one major and one minor. All that is flexible as per what the student or the learner wants to decide.
Thank you so much, ma'am. This will be the last question. I am inviting Dr. Om Prakash Dwivedi to please go ahead and ask.
The question was that how are we going to advance and promote the so-called universalistic nature of higher education that ma'am pointed out in a talk, with so much emphasis on privatization, self-sustainability, opening up of foreign universities, and availability of financial agencies. So where does a common student from lower or even middle class group feature in it? Given my own understanding, I see it more of a capitalistic arrangement than a democratization, than a democratic one of higher education.
Thank you, Dr. Dwivedi. I fully appreciate your concerns about this policy, which has also been featuring in many sections of the media. And I take this as an opportunity to set at rest some of the concerns and make you feel a sense of reassurance that this is not a policy that has toppled the cart, so to say, from the 86 policy. The first and most important aspect of this particular policy and a particular segment on curbing commercialization of education. All the policies so far, and as per a Supreme Court judgment, where we have clearly spelled out that education is a social good and is a public good and cannot be commercialized and cannot be run for profit. Having said that, it is sort of putting a stamp on the idea that this is not a policy which will create a larger divide in the knowledge society. It is a policy which aims at saying education and learning is a right of every aspiring child, and our policy has been very, very categorical in saying that every child, irrespective of circumstances of birth and irrespective of the societal circumstances within which he or she is born, will be given an opportunity to learn, and for which there will be an enhanced set of scholarships, including Gender Inclusion Fund and the special education zones for students coming from the so-called socio-economically disadvantaged sections. Now, with the idea of opening up foreign universities, we should not be resistant to that. As much as of today, the reality is that many number of elitist families are sending their children for undergraduate education outside. By opening foreign universities here and by having affirmative steps and a given set of norms for inclusion, we are actually opening up opportunities for students who cannot go outside to avail the best education even without leaving one's own country. Yes, any opening up of the sector where you allow the private sector, which is what Oro University or Ashoka University or Jindal University and all are offering, will have to be in a competitive spirit. But we have said that public and private institutions will be governed by the same set of norms and the same set of equity considerations, where they have to give about 25 to 50% scholarships and including free ships. Now, all these in a society which is highly competitive, we cannot be blind to the reality that competitiveness adds to the edge of any economy and any individual. But it has to be harmonious, like the Vice Chancellor has said. Competition does not mean that you walk over the competitor. Competition means that you provide for healthy competition and allow the best to win. That is the spirit of any sport. Competition. Ultimately, when you watch a cricket match or you watch a football match, it is a competition. The better party will always win. So we need not look in education that it has to be only by inward looking, not by allowing competition, whether it is with the private sector or whether it is with a foreign university. Rather, seeing that as a enabling opportunity where all are coming together, allowing the best to flower. Let 100 flowers bloom. That is the idea. And that idea is to allow for all potentials to grow. At the same time, the underlying principle has been equity and the non-commercialization of education. I would only be able to say that for your clarification, but this is neither capitalistic as a policy. It is very much recognizing the pluralistic and diverse nature of this country, diversity in terms of language, diversity in terms of religion and caste, diversity in terms of the economic conditions of the society. And this policy has seen to be trying to provide equal opportunities for education to all sections of the society in an equitable manner. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So we are not going to take any further question onto this. If the audience and participants have any questions, they can send it into the question and answer. We will definitely share with ma'am and look forward for the reply. Thank you so much, ma'am. And it is a pleasure and privilege for us to have you virtually with us on this webinar on new national education policy. I do understand there will be a lot of restructuring required on the part of higher education institution in India per se, because academic credit bank in itself is one of the biggest revolution which will come into the life of the students and teachers like us. So I think it will pave a way for people who are looking for cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary education. I think this new national education policy is definitely even forcing teachers to learn to new nuances, create a capacity for learning to learn among the students, to think, and even questioning the question itself, which they are often posed in the life and in the process of teaching and learning. So these are the benefits which we as the teachers have got through your deliberations into this new national education policy. And thank you so much, sir. I would like to invite VC sir for his closing remarks.
It was a wonderful interaction through question and answer session, madam. And I can just say thank you very much for giving us the time, and hope to see you again, maybe in the university or somewhere in the conferences. So thank you very much. People have questions, but now time is short. We can address those questions later. You can write to madam. So thank you very much, madam, for giving.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, and I'd be welcoming any questions I can respond to also, because it will need clarifying it. Yes.
Thank you, ma'am. Look forward to host you in person whenever things get normal.
Let's hope that we tide over COVID. Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much. Stay safe. Stay safe.
Have a nice time. Thank you, everyone.